Could you please come on? Close the door. Okay, welcome everybody. This is, I hope you're in the right place. This is an event on biodiversity, climate change nexus. And we should have an exciting meeting today. We have, how it will work is we have a group of panelists. They'll all speak for 5 minutes. I'll ask them a question and then we'll open it up to all of you to talk to them and each other. So my name is Risa Smith. Just before I introduce myself, I just want to start. Can you hear me? Because now I want to start with a little bit of an acknowledgement about this place where we are. We're on the unceded territory of the Mohawk and Anishinaabe people. And this is a very special place because in ancient times, these nations formed a confederacy with the 5 nations adjacent to them and created a law of peace. And it's very interesting because they had 3 principles. One was democratic governance, one was a common creation story, and the other, and it came with not only about where they came from, but their duty to the earth, so their future duty. And the other was the 7th generation, how to respect future generations. And I think while we're negotiating here at COP and having so much trouble with peace, we'd have a lot to learn from the people who were first here and the way that they dealt with peace. So thank you to the Mohawk people for that. So my name is Risa Smith. I'll be your moderator. I live on a quiet island on the west coast of British Columbia, Canada, where I've been observing shifting baselines for 35 years in our coastal ecosystems, our forests, and our wetlands. I co-chair the Protected Areas Climate Change Specialist Group with the World Commission on Protected Areas. And for 15 years previous to that, I came to many CBD meetings representing the Government of Canada. I'm really, with that history, I'm very hopeful, and some of you maybe aren't as hopeful as me, that we will have a very positive post-2020 global biodiversity framework in the end when it comes down to the 11th wire. And I'm hoping that it'll include recognition of the relationship between biodiversity, climate change, and the well-being of ecosystems and people. So I just want to introduce our speakers. So first, I'll introduce Cyril first. That's Cyril Kormos. Cyril is my co-lead on this whole event, and he has made a, sorry. He's the founder and executive director of Wild Heritage, whose mission is to restore and protect ecosystem integrity and safeguard biocultural diversity in the world. Hopefully you've seen Cyril around COP15, inside and outside the venue, working endlessly to support a global moratorium on logging and climate reports. Cyril also serves as the IUCN WCPA Vice Chair for World Heritage and is a trustee of Wild Europe. Rande Cooke at the end. Chief Makwala, also known as Rande Cooke, is a hereditary chief, forest ecology advocate, and artist who explores a combined traditional and contemporary style of art that incorporates science, culture, and a passion for protecting the cultural diversity dependent on old growth ecosystems. He's also from British Columbia. He's a founding director of the Awi'nakola Foundation. Did I say it right? Awi'nakola, okay. An organization combining Indigenous knowledge, Western science, and arts. And he's also a proud father, probably a recent father. Next to him is Jay Ritchlin. Jay's Director General for Western Canada of the David Suzuki Foundation. He has more than 20 years experience working on solutions to environmental challenges in a wide range of issues. He leads a team dedicated to action on the David Suzuki Foundation mission that we are one with nature. For solutions that provide benefits for biodiversity, climate change, and people supporting municipal leaders on developing ambitious and equitable climate plans, holding governments to account on the substantial footprint of industrial logging, and so much more. Last but definitely not least is Lorna Harris, who just came from another session, so I was pretty impressed with this. Dr. Lorna Harris is the program lead for the Forests, Peatlands, and Climate Change program of the Wildlife Conservation Society. She's an ecosystem scientist who has worked to improve scientific understanding of wetlands and peatland ecosystems for over 17 years. Over the years, Lorna has worked to create stronger links between science and policy for peatlands. Lorna is also a coordinating lead author for global policy and global peatlands assessment led by the UNEP Global Peatlands Initiative. So I'm going to just start with a little quick introduction and then get on to the speakers. I want to acknowledge all of our partners, all wonderful organizations employing incredible things. One speaker couldn't come. He was a bit late trying to get a visa. Just didn't work out. I think there's been quite a bit of that. That's me. So I just put this map up. So we're talking about the biodiversity climate change nexus in this, and there's many maps at the global scale and at the regional scale that try to capture where this nexus is, where are the places that are important for biodiversity and important for climate change. This is just one map that tries to do that in different ways. And as you've heard throughout this meeting, there's many different ways. It's easy to measure climate change, but very difficult to measure biodiversity. So all of these different analyses look at different ways to measure biodiversity. But I think the dark brown on the left, that shows you some of the important areas that come up in every mapping anyway. So just to give you, and the kinds of ecosystems that we're talking about where this nexus occurs are tropical forests. This is the Amazon, coastal temperate rainforests. This is on the west coast of west coast of the Americas, actually. Boreal forests, tropical peat forests. This particular picture is in the Congo Basin. Northern peatlands, savanna, which we won't talk about in detail today, just as a matter of time, but these are the types of ecosystems with all the carbon below ground, or most of it. Temperate grasslands also, and coastal blue carbon. I had to mention that because the coastal blue carbon systems are very important. In an area basis, they actually have more carbon, sequester more, and store more than other ecosystems, but there's so much more forests, for example, on the planet than there are these coastal ecosystems, and that's why they come up. So that's a mangrove. That one happens to be in Cambodia. This is a salt marsh. This one's in Scotland. And this is seagrass, again, all over the world, and very important ecosystem everywhere. And then I just had to do a 1-minute plug for my own work. This is a report on enhancing Canada's climate change ambition with natural climate solutions. And we concluded in that if you look at just the threatened ecosystems that have high carbon and high biodiversity, we could meet our protected areas targets. I'm not suggesting that's the only way to do it, but there is a nexus between these two policy departments. So I think, Cyril, I'll send it over to you. We know how to do this.
Thank you, Risa. This is more than a 5-minute PowerPoint, so I'm going to try to speed through it at warp speed. We'll be talking about primary forests today, and trying to give a sense for why they're absolutely essential for both meeting our biodiversity targets and objectives and our climate change targets and objectives at the same time, and also for resolving any number of other social and environmental crises that we face around the world today. So they're really a convergence point, a critical convergence point for many of the most important issues that we're trying to resolve. Primary forest is basically a naturally regenerating forest that's the result of ecological processes, not human management, and that hasn't been degraded by industrial activity, logging, or industrial activities. The critical point here is that a primary forest is really something that has been evolving. It's an ecosystem, a superorganism that's been evolving over hundreds of thousands of years, and over that time has adapted itself to the environment and created the conditions under which it can maximize its biological productivity and maximize the ecosystem service it provides. So it's an irreplaceable, unique ecosystem, highly adapted to its environment, and which maximize ecosystem services. They are going very, very fast. I won't go over this slide. There's about a quarter of the planet's forests are primary ecosystems and going very quickly. And as I said, they're really an incredibly important nexus for convergent point. For one, they are the homelands of indigenous peoples all over the world. For large numbers of cases, they continue to be primary forests explicitly because they are managed and stewarded by indigenous people. So that is a critical nexus. They're vital to their cultures, livelihoods, rights. It's really a critical nexus for social justice and indigenous peoples the world over. They're essential for biodiversity. The most estimates of the levels of biodiversity in primary tropical forests is about 66% of terrestrial species. Some estimates go all the way up to 80% just for primary tropical forest. If you add in boreal and temperate, that percentage must go even higher. So you don't resolve the biodiversity crisis without primary forests. 3 points, a couple of points on climate change. First, we're basically out of time. About 8 years of emissions left, a carbon budget of about 400 gigatons of CO2, which is very small. The carbon stock in primary forests alone is higher than that. So if we were to clear our remaining primary forests, we would exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's without all the other ecosystems on the planet, primary or not primary. The point is the carbon stock that has already accumulated in these forests is vast. If you release even a fraction of that, we blow our chance to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade, regardless of what we do with fossil fuels. We can get off of fossil fuels tomorrow, and we still have a climate crisis on our hands just for land use. So please retain that absolutely important point. Primary forests store much more carbon than degraded forests. You do one cut in a primary tropical forest, you lose over a third of the carbon immediately, right? You can't do that. You can't log sustainably. You can't have industrial activity and expect to meet any targets by 2050. It's not doable. Not only do primary forests store more carbon, not only do they store vast carbon stocks, not only do they store much more carbon than in the degraded forest, the carbon they store is also more stable. As a result of the biodiversity, these forests are far more resistant to natural disturbance and far more resilient. They bounce back much faster when disturbance occurs. So this means their carbon is at much lower risk. Primary forests will be around in a few hundred years. A degraded forest may burn, it may succumb to drought, to an insect infestation. We don't know if it's going to be around. The carbon in a stable, resilient primary forest is much, much more secure. It's a far lower risk investment than degraded forest. And maybe I'll flip through this, but they're also very important to the restoration agenda. Even tiny fragments of primary forest can be used as basically the focal point for restoration in a highly fragmented landscape. Forest recovers much, much more easily if you still have these small areas of primary forest remaining. So, how am I doing in time? Speeding along? Okay. This is not a new policy concept. We got decisions on primary forest, and they're important in the CBD in 2018. It's in the Glasgow Climate Pact and the Glasgow Leaders Declaration that we need to focus on ecosystem integrity and reversing forest loss and degradation. And critically, in the IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 report, there was a lot of strong language on the importance of primary forest. So this is not at all a new idea. The concern I have, and we have as part of the Primary Forest Alliance, is that these concepts of ecosystem integrity, primary forest, and synergistic climate and biodiversity outcomes be integrated into the targets. It's not enough to have them in the general decisions of the CBD. We need to integrate them into the GBF and make sure that they're not left out. This is also why we are calling for a moratorium on industrial activity in primary forests. It is completely irrational not to protect the places that have by far the highest biodiversity and by far the highest carbon stocks and the safest carbon stocks if our goal is to prevent catastrophic climate change and prevent the loss of the diversity of life on Earth. This is where you start. So they are not the only forests we need to protect. They are not the only ecosystems that we need to protect, but if we don't protect these, we will not succeed. So it's a minimum, and it's a necessary minimum without which we will not succeed on any of the goals that we're trying to achieve here. Social justice, biocultural, biodiversity, climate change, all together must be solved together, cannot be separated. And the greatest chance of success is if we address these things jointly. So thank you very much. Sorry for going so fast.
Thank you. Thank you, Cyril. I'm Rande Cooke from Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Alert Bay, BC is my hometown where I was born. I'm First Nations. I'm a chief, Chief Makpula from one of the tribes, the Montaguila of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. What brings me here today is actually to share and bounce a little bit more of who we are as Indigenous people off of the science that we're finding. We're in this very critical time, as we know, when we talk about the essence of our primary forests, but also the protection of biodiversity. Our stories have come from the very beginnings. And what we're finding now through science and research, for us as the Awi'nakola Foundation, we partnered with the Mother Tree Foundation led by Suzanne Simard. So we get out and we do everything from archaeological digs to different plots and looking at soils, plants, and different tree societies in relations to medicinal properties. So looking at all of those, what we do is we go back and we look at ancient village sites. And what we're starting to find is the richest carbon found is in ancient village sites. So if you want to have rich carbon and then biodiversity, we have to stimulate the culture and the growth of getting us as Indigenous people back into our traditional territories. But what we're finding today is that we're still in a crisis as Indigenous people because the Canadian government is not allowing us to pave our way back to the traditional territories because we're still under threat and we're faced with a very fast race against industry as they're moving, as fast as they can to essentially take as much as they possibly can at a very fast rate. So I've got some images that I just wanted to share because 5 minutes isn't a lot of time, but I think on a panel like this, bouncing around from science and into the social impacts of who we are as Indigenous people, faced with the impacts of logging, puts us into a place where we're starting to question our own culture. Because we are people of the forest and we've had this relationship with the land for tens of thousands of years. So some of the questions that I'm asking to our communities is who are we as Kwakwaka'wakw people if we are disconnected and we don't have that connection to the natural environment? If all our songs and dances and spiritual connection has tapped into the energy fields of these forests from time immemorial, without these forests, how are we going to serve? So the social impacts are really important. What we're seeing in our communities, because we've been focused and stationed on reserves for so long, is with youth. I mean, unfortunately, there's a high suicide rate. There's a lot of abuse. We've suffered the abuse of Canada. I mean, we're still kind of healing from, essentially, we are healing from the impacts of residential schools and so on. So what's happening is we have our people who are yearning to get back to our traditional territories because we know that is our reset button where we can begin to heal. But we cannot get back to these areas if we do not have, if we don't start protecting these forests. So from the very beginnings, I mean, we've had a very rich culture. I mean, until essentially the Industrial Revolution and then the fur trade, the introduction of currency started to divorce us from our natural environment. It started to create a system where it was all, around economics and trade and building up. But the Canadian government coming along after so long and recognizing that, we were maintaining and looking after our resources, but we were trading it in such strong abundance, had created the residential schools to remove us from the land. And the image like this is potlatch preparation, actually, of all the goods that would have been given away. These are Edward Curtis images, and this is a wedding, but this is just talking about some of our early origin stories of mythical creatures who descended, because I think these moments are important when we go back and we talk about why our connection to the land is important. When we first started to, develop and look at houses and the way we shared knowledge, this knowledge actually came from the forest. Everything that we were and are was all focused around the significance of all of the energy that these primary forests had evolved and developed, but all the medicinal properties that helped us to sustain along the coast. This is me standing in my traditional territory, holding a mask again, talking about culture and relationship to land. These are some of our very last old growth forests that we have. Like I say, we're under attack even right now at home. Like, industry is moving very fast. We're doing as much as we can, but there's just not enough work. And I think, coming back to spaces like this and working with the panel as such, we can begin to work together to start thinking about how we can preserve the rest of the essentially 2.7% of old growth in all of BC, which isn't that much. So when I first started going into the forest, I grew up obviously, in our territories, but I started thinking about culturally modified trees. And what really hit me was the fact that industry in the process of clear cutting is wiping out culturally modified trees. These trees have actually been, some of them we can count back to 500-600 years prior to Canada. And these are relationships that were developed in these territories, which we call home. Some of these, by removing these trees, essentially what we're finding is that we're erasing our existence. The government industry is erasing our relationship, our existence in these certain territories. And there's a lot more to culturally modified trees than actually just harvesting and thinking about, the bark preparation and using the bark to make goods and all of, the things we might have used for regalia. When I was working with Suzanne Smart, we're walking through one of these old forests, and I started to look at tree societies. And as we were looking at different plants in connection to these different tree societies, I started looking at some areas that were really dry. Looking at in relationship to some of the plantations in these second growth forests, we started to recognize that maybe over time, these culturally modified trees, there's a little bit more to it. So understanding the ancient science that we're trying to recover as Indigenous people, by essentially pulling the bark on the tree would send signals to other trees, which would then fire back nutrients and different properties to help stimulate that area to help more, to prepare for years to come for more medicinal plants. So we're losing this in the process, and there's so many different species of plants yet to be, discovered. Along with, when we look into soil. This is the reality of today. We're seeing this more and more, and again, how do we essentially remarry and find ourselves way back on their way back to understanding the importance of the natural environment and these rich forests, which I'm excited to hear more from the panel around the extended science of that. But I just wanted to share a little bit about who we are as Indigenous people and why this is so important to us. Essentially, by wiping out these forests, you're erasing us as Indigenous people from the land, because that's our culture. Our culture is deeply embedded in this. We are not just fighting for these forests as Kwakwaka'wakw people in our territories. We're fighting for our actual identity and our culture and who we are. So all of that goes hand in hand. And we know that if we can get back into our territories and start protecting those, then we could be the ones who can start to change the planet and bring it back to what it once was, where we are essentially going to be the climate justice activists and everything else that comes with that, that's going to be along the path of healing. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, to the whole panel. I'm Ritchlin from the Suzuki Foundation. I direct our nature programming and our Western Canada operations, and I live, work, and play in the unceded territories of the Squamish Nation in British Columbia, very near the long-time traditional seasonal village of Chipmunk. Pleased to be here on the territory of Chile. To talk a little bit about the places that a lot of people now live, which is not traditional territories. It is cities, urban and peri-urban areas. In a little less than 100, or a little over 100 years, Vancouver went from this was Vancouver in the 1900s, around 1900. There are archives in the Vancouver Museum that talk about the elk hunts that the Musqueam chiefs in the region used to conduct in this area. The catalog of animals, large mammals and other species that were wandering in the shared territory that was used for coming together, harvesting in certain seasons, and making different kinds of treaties and marriages and all sorts of things that kept the land and these cultures alive, was at the confluence of the ocean, the river, and the land. Fraser River is there. I don't know how many people are fans of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, but Douglas Adams, one of the great philosophers of our time, he noted that human beings seem to like to live in the confluence of things. So his was the space-time continuum, but here we have oceans, rivers, and lands. When European settlers came, they saw a giant resource there that could be taken and exploited quickly for wealth. And this is what started happening within 10 to 20 years of that settlement starting to take hold. And so these territories that had been used and shared for millennia were quickly converted into places for permanent human settlements that only sought to grow, establish, and grow. And as we probably know, if we study any of these things, one of the major drivers of species loss and habitat decline is urban development. Urban growth. In Canada, the percentages of endangered species that are in proximity to or being driven into extinction by urban development expansion is over 60%. Some would say it's over 70% of the species in Canada that are at risk are from our cities. And in Canada, a city is about 5,000 people if it's got pavement and a sewer. So it doesn't just mean the mega cities. We did this thinking that we were, building a new society that was going to be great. And we brought our ideas of culture and didn't do a lot to try and reconcile those with, or maybe did nothing and maybe did exactly the opposite of trying to reconcile those with the cultures and the laws and the governance that were already there. And after not too long, this is what the city of Vancouver would start to build itself on. This area where there was hunting, fishing, trapping, there were agriculture, there were all sorts of feasts and ceremonies and cultural traditions that had existed, as we say, for many thousands of years, became what looks like Mordor to me. I don't know. And now you can take this photo from a travel brochure. It looks like an amazingly beautiful place. And I live there, I live outside there up towards those mountains. It is an amazingly beautiful place, but it is also a complete block on the flows of ecosystem services, biodiversity, and the health of, I think, both cultures and creatures in nature. So at the David Suzuki Foundation, we have a founding principle called the Declaration of Interdependence. And David Suzuki and his wife, Tara Cullis, have always told us that we are here to relearn from the indigenous people of this land about how to live there. It's not always easy to do when you live in the middle of a city like that and you face the pressures of governance and commerce and industry, populations moving, immigration, migration. So one of the things that we have started to try and do is to work with the concept of nature as an asset. I almost hate saying it sometimes, but cities and urban planners and bankers and industries, they think in terms of assets. So we have started to try and develop systems where people living in these kind of developed areas can understand what nature does for them. Natural assets, natural infrastructure. And without monetizing nature or putting a price on nature, you can start to explain to people in these places the value of what nature does for them and to learn and perhaps start to relearn how to appreciate, incorporate, and then grow that value. So while we're working to shift this culture back to a different way of thinking, to blend the ideas of understanding how connected we are to nature, slowly but surely we're trying to teach people, cities, municipal planners, local governments, that yes, we are all nature and we are benefiting from it. Because when you say something like, oh, well, nature is priceless or water is priceless, in this culture today, what you're saying is that it has zero value. It has no value in a cost-benefit analysis. So if we can at least start to say the amount of service from those mountains to the north of Vancouver there in holding the slopes in place, filtering the air, providing clean water, and you compare that to the concrete, steel, and operating and maintenance costs that a traditional, it's just the wrong word, that a modern waste treatment system, water purification system, slope stabilization, you can start to see very quickly that investing in nature, understanding how it works for us, and trying to rebuild it in the places where it is supposed to be is of real value to all of us. And along the way, hopefully, that opens us up as well to learning a deeper level of understanding about that connection and investing not only our money and our time, but ourselves and our spirits, if you will, into that connection. I'll just stop there and answer questions about that. Thank you very much.
So switching a little bit from forests, which to peatlands. So my name is Lorna Harris. I'm a peatland scientist. I live in Edmonton in Alberta, Treaty 6 territory, the meeting place of multiple Indigenous peoples. You might tell from my accent, though, that I am originally from the UK. I worked in Scotland for 7 years, working on those Scottish peat bogs. I am from Northern England, from Newcastle, so that's where the accent, if you want to place that accent. But I've been in Canada for 10 years now, and I've stayed here because it has some of the most amazing peatlands in the world. So this photograph here is just showing the Bay Lowland peatlands in Northern Ontario. And why peatlands in Canada? Why is it particularly important right now at COP15 in Canada? Canada has 1/4 of the world's peatlands. That's a lot of peat. And you can really see this right on the map there, really standing out there. Peatlands globally on this map cover 3% of the land surface, but they store around 30% of the global soil carbon. So in terms of a carbon store, they are much more than the primary forests that you've also heard about before. And most of that carbon is below ground, not in the trees above. It is below ground carbon. I'm going to explain in a little bit. So this just shows the peatlands across Canada. You can see the Hudson Bay Lowland there. It is the world's second largest peatland complex after the West Siberian lowlands in Russia. This area is bigger than Germany. It stores 30 to 35 billion tons of carbon, and it is actively sequestering carbon as well. You can also see we've got large peatland areas through northern Alberta and up into the Northwest Territories as well. So why are we talking about peatlands? You might have seen on some of the maps, the forests in Canada, obviously amazing. We've got some amazing forests. We also have forested peatlands, which just confuses things a little bit. You can't really see where the peatlands are because there's all of the trees. So yeah, we've got massive amounts of forested peatlands. So the peat is often forgot about. All of that carbon stored below ground. So yeah, here we're just seeing a map of the carbon stocks for provinces and territories across Canada. You can see that Ontario by far has the largest carbon stock, around 39. And Manitoba has a lot of carbon. tons in the Northwest Territories as well. Crossing 3 provinces, that's 30 to 35 billion tons of carbon. So as I've just said, peatlands are a little different to forests. Most of that carbon is stored below ground. It is not in the above ground biomass. So the power of peatlands is their ability to capture that carbon and store it for a very, very, very long time. We're talking thousands and thousands of years. So over the past 10,000 years, the accumulation and long-term storage of carbon in these systems has actually cooled the climate. So these systems have been really important in setting our climate system that humans have thrived in, basically, over the last 10,000 years. And carbon is much more stable than a lot of above ground carbon stocks because it is in there in waterlogged soils, and it is often in northern climates in permafrost soils, so it's permanently frozen as well. So these landscapes across Canada, they're some of the last remaining large intact landscapes on the planet. Hudson Bay Lowland is a high integrity peatland. There are very, very few roads or develops this landscape. There's only winter roads, so they're not permanent all season roads, just some winter roads going across the north and up the coast. And it's just all peat as far as the eye can see. That is literally what you see when you fly over there for like 2 hours, just peat. Peatlands are also really important for biodiversity. So from caribou here to the amazing sphagnum mosses across these peatlands, the migratory birds, really important to Hudson Bay Lowland for migratory birds. Lichens as well, dragonflies, some of the biggest dragonflies I've ever seen are in these peatlands. So they're not just a carbon stock, they're really, really important for biodiversity. But they are under threat, and we do need to consider policy solutions to help to safeguard these really significant peatland areas. So as you've heard probably a lot of COP15 already, Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship is really important for peatland protection and management in Canada. Many of these lands are the homelands of Indigenous peoples. We do need to strengthen regulations for impact assessment and for road planning. We also need to improve greenhouse gas reporting for peatlands in Canada's national inventory. Currently, we only count carbon loss from peat extracted for horticulture and areas of peatland that were flooded for hydroelectricity. We do not count the carbon lost from peatlands that are damaged by mining, logging activities, agriculture. They're all missing. Road development as well, that's missing. Drainage is missing. Fires and permafrost though, we're not tracking those either, which for the amount of peatland that we have in Canada, that's a lot of potential carbon loss. And obviously also creating finance and credit incentives for the avoided conversion of these landscapes. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions on this.
Rather than have me ask questions, I think I'll open up to the audience because we have a little time. So I'll see if I can. Do you hear that?
Yeah, thank you for your, your impressions. I think there was a really interesting diversity over here. I come from India. I work with the WCS, and I've been involved with mangrove restoration work for a bit. And what we're seeing now, after the UN, the declaration of the UN Decade for Restoration, is we have lost lots of areas, and we've seen this massive push into just plantations. And the whole point is, how do we kind of reincorporate biodiversity into this? Because right now it's monocultures, it is big companies getting involved, and what's happening is we're kind of really losing that restoration by design, if I may say. From the words of TNC, but like you rightfully spoke about, Indigenous territory and keeping diversity and also community central to this. And also, I just wanted to know what's your, very broad message when it comes to something like this. Y'all have lots of intact, primary forests, peatlands, etc. But in areas where, where there's a huge driver and things are changing rapidly, what would you say is, obviously, preserving these prime patches would be key, but what would you say would be like the key principles, if you had to go ahead with something to do with restoration? Sorry, my question is kind of directed to anyone.
Did anybody want to ask?
I can't.
Yes.
So I think there's two things to distinguish here. There are many reasons to plant trees, and there are many reasons to do restoration. Climate change mitigation is not a good reason to plant trees, because the tiny little seedling that you plant today won't absorb a lot of carbon by 2050. So that's not a very efficient carbon solution. And what people are beginning to realize is that if you wanted to plant your way out of climate change, you'd need an area the size of India to do that. And obviously that has implications for biodiversity, and it has implications for agriculture and land use. So we're not going to plant our way out of the climate situation. So the top two things you can do from a climate mitigation standpoint are, one, protect the existing carbon stock, and two, restore an area that's already degraded but could recover. And because the medium-sized trees will absorb far more carbon over 30 years than the baby seedlings. But there's obviously lots of reasons to restore forests and to plant trees. If your lands have been clear cut and you're an indigenous First Nation, then you have a very strong interest in replanting trees. So it's not like replanting is a bad thing per se, but it is not a climate strategy per se either. And so I think just distinguishing between those two things is really important. And so there is a bit of a hierarchy here. One is protect what's there. Two is restore what's degraded. And three is let the forest come back on its own. I mean, birds, pigs, monkeys will replant the forest far better than we will, and it's a lot cheaper and more effective.
Did you want to ask?
Just quickly, yeah. I would say just quickly too, in my presentation, I didn't really address the climate piece so much, but one of the big drivers is the conversion of existing land, whether or not it's primary forest, and cities, and the growth of cities is definitely one of the things that is causing that conversion. So growing our cities in ways that try to preserve the ecosystem functions, understanding what's there and understanding how to preserve it in multiple dimensions as we grow places for people is one of the pieces.
Thanks. There's a question back there.
Yeah, I'm Harrison Noko. Harrison Noko. I'm the CEO of AJESH, IUCN member, and I'm glad to see a member of the Commission on Protected Areas. My question was twofold. The first is on the presentation that the chief and the director for David presented. My worry is in Africa, particularly in Cameroon, where I come from, the local communities and the councils also want to have their villages or their towns become cities. How do we blend this with protecting our forests, taking into account? I'm an advocate for primary forests also, but how do we create this balance of development and protection? We need to, I just want us to reflect on that and see if we can come about. The other part, I come from the southwest, the English-speaking part of Cameroon, where we have serious socio-political crisis. And that's the part of Cameroon that accommodates one of the highest number of protected areas, national parks. And as we speak, you're having serious socio-political conflicts. And these protected areas, same as in the northern part of Cameroon, are accommodating some of these primary forests. I don't know, in the hall, I'm seeing some of us are working in protected areas. How do we manage, or what reflections are we taking towards managing protected areas, primary forests, within crisis zones?
Thank you. I think for us here, well, not here, but I mean, British Columbia, where I'm from, more concerned about reconnecting with the natural environment again, considering that there's so much development that has been happening all around us. We've got so many different nations who are signing agreements with government and developing, but yet we have other nations who are in very remote areas, such as ours, who are on the Great Bear Rainforest. And looking at that relationship is more important. And where we're starting to understand and think, what is the 100-year plan that we can start to put in place that is going to sustain us as we once did for thousands of years? So it's really a difference between each nation and where they're located geographically, because it's really the government who comes in, who's initiating these. So it's still capitalism who's driving these development projects and initiating it essentially between nations and proposing different ideas and making it lucrative. Some of the ideas that we're talking about here now is like carbon credits, but what does that look like? So for us, if we're going to transfer and say, and look at a long, like project the next 100 years and what sustainability can be in relationship to the land by just not logging it all, stopping everything completely, and allowing the natural primary forests to just do their thing and heal. And then how can we gain, from that? So there's a lot of really big, complex conversations that are happening. But for us as Indigenous people in Canada, they created a system where we would put on reserves. And then these reserves are run by band councils who then are essentially communicating through to the government. So it's a design that's still in effect. So we actually have a system between these elected systems and the hereditary system. The hereditary chiefs who are showing you, who are connected from origin stories from time immemorial, those are the ones who know that their responsibility is to the land first, not to drive or continue or contribute to this, the capitalism and the consumerism or anything that is essentially coming from government. It really comes down to that relationship with the land and what we can start to do to heal it again. But what we're finding now is that the Canadian government comes in and they're proposing these different deals and are offering money, which is pitting Indigenous people against each other. So we might have an idea, an image that Indigenous people, we're very good, and yes, like paving the way forward will help us to heal the land, but we are also struggling with that system because it's not just non-Indigenous people who are a part of that, when we're buying into capitalism, it's also our own people too, as you're saying, like maybe it's the same there. These ideas and thinking that maybe development is going to save us, that we can, be a part of some sort of economic drive that's going to kind of feed our people. But really we're understanding that's just the system that we're buying into again, that isn't going to serve. That's where we're going down the wrong path. So there's a big division in that for us right now, to answer your question, as Indigenous people. But there's a lot of urban areas where they don't have, there's been so much development. Like you can take the Musqueam people of the Squamish in Vancouver, for example, who are now making very lucrative deals with government on development projects because, their percentage of primary forests or resources in that regard are very limited now. The percentages are much higher for development. But for us in our areas, we don't have any areas for development. So our key goal is to really focus on the healing of the natural environment.
Just two other people really wanting to ask questions.
I don't know how you stop.
Hello, Ian Dunn from Plant Life International. A question for Lorna. So you showed us a lot about the carbon of peatlands, and in fact your slide there is very pertinent in terms of the permafrost. Can you say something about methane and what you're seeing from methane and the impact that could have as well on the climate agenda?
Yeah, so the permafrost peatland that you can see there, it's actually a site that is thawing quite rapidly in northern Alberta. And we are actually measuring methane emissions at that site from my postdoc when I was at University of Alberta. Methane emissions from thawing permafrost areas can be quite high, especially in new thermokarst areas. That's where the peat plateau, the frozen peat plateau, has collapsed. The trees, basically, we call them drunken trees because they're all leaning over into these much wetter areas. They just die within these wetter areas. But there's also new sphagnum growth within these areas too, new moss growth. So there's actually quite a lot of carbon dioxide uptake into the system at this time as there being methane emissions. So when we talk about carbon release and carbon uptake in peatland ecosystems or any ecosystem, we do have to look at all of those fluxes into and out of the system. So there are high methane emissions. There are high methane emissions in a lot of wetlands ecosystems, but they're not as high as what you get, for example, from oil development, from the leaks that you get from pipelines. These are natural systems that have been releasing methane over that 10,000 years they've been developing, but the balance of that carbon over time is being as a sink over thousands and thousands of years. So even as they've released a little bit of methane, they've released a little bit of CO2 over that time. Overall, the balance is, in the good.
We're going to get booted out of here. So we have 2 more questions, maybe time for 3. So.
Hi, everybody. Dominic Delasala with Wild Heritage. I work with Cyril, the chief scientist. I guess it's a question, but I'll pose it as such. But in terms of emissions from fire in Canada, for instance, I get more worried about the emissions from logging. And Canada has a really poor track record of estimating emissions from logging. It's grossly underestimating its logging footprint emissions. And so even if you do get to a point where you're estimating wildfire emissions, the work that I've done on the ground, measuring carbon in forests that have gone through big forest fires, is most of the carbon remains in the forest after a severe burn, but it's taken out of the forest when it's logged. And so it's just something to think about. Be careful what you wish for, because if Canada starts tracking its wildfire emissions, it's going to use it as a shell game, which is what's happened in the US. The emissions from logging are 5 to 10 times greater than the combined emissions of wildfires, insects, and wind damage in forests in the United States, which has a lot of forest fires. And so Canada's got a lot of forest fires too. So I wonder if you would just comment on that briefly, that your emissions load is really serious on the logging problem.
I think instead of having you guys answer that, I think Dominic's given us a good sort of summary there of what you might answer, because we're running out of time and there's 2 other questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Ritchlin. I work with natural justice in South Africa, in Mozambique, and in Namibia. And most of what has come from the representative of indigenous people is very, it resonates with the work that we're doing. My question is, after having heard the solutions that Lorna talked about policy solutions and community-led initiatives, and then being in the other room where they were talking about carbon offsets, I got kind of worried that where I come from, when we talk about money and all these figures that were being thrown around, maybe I'm a little bit not understanding that topic, but my worry is that where I come from, policy and decision makers tend to follow where big numbers are being talked about. And it has become like a battle for middle earth, for me, it has become like a battle for middle earth. So what would be our solution when we talk about carbon offsets in our jurisdictions? Is it true that it's a solution or it's a false solution? I mean, talking about your suggestion to leave, primary forests as they are and as a solution. And I'm also hoping to learn a lot, because that is exactly the work I do, trying to make policy and decision makers understand the importance of biodiversity and the nexus with climate change. Thank you.
I think I'm going to let Jay answer that first, because I know he's very passionate about that subject. And I will say we had a very passionate discussion about this last night in a different event that I was at. So I think one thing that you raised is this whole idea of carbon offsets and all the different financial tools that are somehow going to save us. We're really thinking at WCPA of doing a nice briefing on what all those tools actually mean in a language that we can all understand. because I learned last night that's not what I thought. So it's a very good question.
Thanks. I'll try to be very brief, but I think there's a combination that we need, which is very strict international standards agreed at places like this for what is a legitimate nature-based carbon solution with some very strong limits. 5–10% in Canada, we argue, should be allowed of all our carbon emission reduction should be through some kind of offsetting and crediting. And then only for those places where you cannot reduce the carbon easily in any other way. The rest of the work has to come from stopping the degradation or conversion of existing land, restoring what can be restored, and reducing our fossil fuel outputs. We can't count on nature to dig us out of this hole. So the carbon credit, carbon offsets piece, it could be a viable and valuable, it will be a viable and valuable part of it if we constrain it and regulate it, and we don't allow it to be a free-for-all. But once we have those strong international standards for what is a credible carbon nature solution and what percentage of them should we be willing to accept, then we need to have the leadership for what those look like come from the local and indigenous communities so that they tell us what will work in their eco zone. And then we also know that, yes, this fits in with what the globe can handle from a real scientific perspective in terms of offsets versus all those other solutions.
Cyril
Cyril's going to take the microphone away from you.
Very, very quickly. We spend about $700–800 billion subsidizing extractive industries, oil and gas and forestry. When we add in roads, hydro, industrial agriculture, everything else, it comes to about $1.5 trillion a year. Of the climate finance, public and private, to mitigation and adaptation included, that's about $650 billion a year. Only 3% of that goes to forests. So if you ended those subsidies and vastly increased the climate funding, you would not only be able to pay protected areas, communities, and indigenous peoples to do the work they need to do to save the diversity of life on Earth, you would also avoid trillions of dollars in costs from climate change and all sorts of other problems like freshwater, pandemics, et cetera. So there may be room for a small amount of offsets, but first let's make sure that we stop, the incredible subsidy of destruction that's completely unnecessary. And let's redirect the climate funding in ways that are productive onto the ground to the people and the communities that can solve the problem.
Thanks very much, everybody. Our time has come to an end. I know they'll kick us out, and we do have some nice snacks for you, so please grab something to eat on the way out. And this discussion, of course, is not over. It'll be happen in many places throughout this time, and I'd like to thank Zoltan particularly for doing the effort to video it, and we have a YouTube channel. We'll put this on plus the slides. So thanks, everybody, and I hope I'll be meeting you throughout the meeting. Thanks.